So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Danny Clark. If you've not seen me before, I am the founder of Simply People. So Simply People are the fastest growing occupational health and wellbeing community in the UK, which is fantastic, and we help clients to find the right providers first time and offer a triage service to help them engage with providers as well. We also support providers themselves with a range of support, skills development and events such as this. And today we are presenting Return to Work Post Restrictions, and the session is delivered by the wonderful Jodie Hill, who is the founder of Thrive Law. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box, which you should find just on the right hand side of your screen, and we'll bring them up during the session and answer them at the end or as we go forwards. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Jodie. So just a bit of background on Jodie, our presenter today. Jodie is trained as a barrister. She cross-qualified as a solicitor and founded Thrive Law in 2018. She is the founder and managing director of the multi-award winning company, and they are headquarters in Leeds City Centre. She's specialised in employment law throughout her career and has a keen understanding of this complex legal sector, together with all other HR related issues. So Jodie is our presenter for a number of topics that we have coming up and have delivered in the past around occupational health and employment law, and please do feel free to ask any questions and we'll answer them at the end. So without further ado, Jodie, over to you.
Amazing, thank you so much. So yeah, we will be taking questions. One thing I should always caveat with is that I can't give specific legal advice on a webinar. What I can do is guide you kind of generally, but if there's something really specific or really personal, then you can just email me and I'll answer that question privately. But for the purposes of today, please do ask questions, get engaged, and no question is a stupid question. So like I say, pop the questions in the chat box and we'll get started. So first of all, Danny and I were going to run this in January, but given that lockdown is still ongoing, we figured actually we should move the talk, but to not that it's because we know when we're coming out. By the way, I don't actually know when lockdown's ending, sorry, but there are lots of things that we can do to kind of plan for the future and plan for a better workplace once we come out of lockdown. So I'm going to turn my camera off and work through the slides with you. Like I say, if I've got any questions, pop them in the chat box and I will see you at the other side. Okay, so just before we get started, I'm just going to explain a little bit about Thrive. So Thrive is my firm. We set up 3 years ago, literally 3 years ago in a couple of weeks, and the real focus that we have at Thrive is around mental health in the workplace, but predominantly we're an employment law firm with diversity and inclusion very much at the heart of what we do. So we have a team now of 12, I think, which is quite scary, but we're a Leeds-based firm, but we're with a national presence with people living all over the UK, and we all work fully remotely. So actually, when we went into lockdown, we were in quite a good position because we were already remote working. We already knew exactly what we were doing with our systems and everything. So we were in a good position to basically support people with all of the challenges that that people were facing when they had to go in quite quickly. And as we just talked about before, we do a lot of stuff around mental health as well. So I will touch on that a little bit in today's session. So what to expect? I think it's really difficult because we're in the third lockdown, and ultimately what happens now is slightly different to what happened when we came out of the other 2 lockdowns, mainly because we've got a vaccine. So I think it's really important that we consider the risks in the workplace when we go back. The only thing we actually know, and unfortunately I don't have any more information, whilst I am pretty good at doing updates if anyone subscribes to our free updates that we do, I actually have no more information other than furlough is currently ending on the 30th. But what we do know is if furlough's ending on the 30th, that lockdown has to end before then. Obviously it would be helpful if it ends much before then. We were told February, but at the moment we don't know. So all we can do is try to plan and obviously to consider what we might need to do so that we're ready when the government do announce that we're out of lockdown. When we had the first lockdown, I think most of us were aware of the shielding individuals in workplaces. Now, the second lockdown, we didn't have that, but then for the third one, they brought shielding individuals back in. So it's slightly different each time. I'm not really sure why they've done that, but ultimately, my view is the future of shielding will be, well, there won't be any more shielding, on the basis that those people who are shielding are likely to be, well, they are in the high risk category, so they're likely to be the people who will have had vaccinations first. So I don't think that the shielding will continue post lockdown, but we don't know yet. So it's just worth considering, and I'll talk a little bit about when people come back, what you need to do around shielding and thinking about disabilities and how to kind of effectively manage that. But one of the things that's clear is that pretty much, I mean, obviously I don't know the demographic of people on the session today, but what I've seen with my clients, and certainly from our perspective, people are being more engaged with home working, flexible working, and even when home working as a mandatory requirement ends, a lot of organisations will still stay there, or at least have a hybrid or flexible approach to it. And last time when we came out of lockdown, the government didn't say, okay, everybody go back in full capacity to work in the office. What they said was, if you could still work from home, still do. So I don't think there's going to be a mad rush, is what I'm getting at. And actually, the reality is, if you can allow people to work from home, especially if they've got childcare issues or a disability, then you really should be considering that. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the future, what I think the future of flexible working is, and some of the things that business owners and managers really need to look out for. Okay, so in terms of considerations, now, I'm not a health and safety advisor, so I'm not going to go into all the health and safety and the guidance. You know, it's very bespoke in terms of every single workplace has specific guidance. But generally, employers need to consider the health and safety of all of their staff, and they can do that in a number of different ways. At the moment, there is a requirement to do a COVID risk assessment for individuals and the workplace. So you need to assess what you basically take specific advice on your organisation in relation to those assessments, and that needs to be in line with the government guidance, which is obviously changing all of the time. So at the moment, we understand that if people are in the workplace, they've still got to comply with all the government guidance in terms of social distancing. In some workplaces, you have to wear masks or visors or both. So it does depend on the type of workplace that you're in. Like I say, you do need to check the specific guidance on that, and it does change. It's likely to change when we come out of lockdown as well, because if the risk has lowered and more people have had vaccinations, they might relax some of the social distancing. But at the moment, they're not saying how much they're going to do that, because what they understand is that the vaccine, whilst it stops individuals from contracting coronavirus, it doesn't actually 100% stop transmission. So what they're saying is, even if your entire workplace has been vaccinated, you will still have to, at the moment, comply with all of the government guidance regarding social distancing, and obviously making sure that your COVID risk assessments are completed. Where you are completing risk assessments, please do keep a paper trail. It's not necessarily onerous on individuals, because you'll have to go through the assessment anyway. But if you keep a paper trail and any issues arise, whether that's a health and safety breach allegation or discrimination allegation, or someone says, I'm refusing to come to work because this workplace isn't safe, then you can use that as an objective justification to say, look, we've gone through the COVID risk assessment, the workplace is safe, and therefore you can come to work because we've complied with the government guidance. So it is important to keep that, so that you have that, not just objective justification, but a paper trail that if anything does happen and it becomes litigious, you have an opportunity to rebut anything that may arise as a result. I talked before about shielding, and that kind of links me to disabilities, because people who are shielding at the moment are in a high risk category, and therefore they're likely to have a disability. Not always, but a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment and has had substantial impact, or it basically has a substantial impact on their ability to do day-to-day tasks. So it's not a diagnosed disability or a blue badge disability. It's the legal definition that I'm talking about here under the Equality Act. So we did a session on that last week. So I think there will be a recording available of that. So if anyone wants to understand a little bit more what is a disability, we also have another one coming up on disabilities and reasonable adjustments, really specifically talking about what's reasonable, when is it a disability, and really looking at some case studies. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that today, but it is something that you need to consider. And usually it'll come up as part of the risk assessment, because as part of that assessment, you're establishing, first of all, like the workplace risk, but secondly, if the individual has any risk. So it might be that they get the bus to work, or it might be that they have anxiety or OCD or another condition that places them in a higher risk category. And if that high risk category could put them into the disability bracket, then you may have to make reasonable adjustments, and one of those might be to allow them to continue working from home, or to allow them to work a different shift pattern. So there's lots of different things that could come up, and like I say, I'll talk more about what's reasonable and the type of adjustments you should be making in the next session. One thing that's unfortunately been really common is that there's a lot of employers failing to follow the actual government guidance on social distancing, and generally just not conducting risk assessments and just not doing anything. Some employers are doing it but not doing it very well, and in those two categories, that's where there's a risk of a whistleblowing complaint or a health and safety detriment claim. And what I mean by that is, if somebody brings an allegation to say for example, they say, do you know what, I'm not coming into work because it's not safe. Now, if you haven't done a risk assessment, or you're not practicing social distancing or complying with the government guidance, then there's a risk that that allegation, provided they give enough information about why it's not safe, could amount to whistleblowing. It could be a protected act. And so these are things that employers need to think about when people are coming back, like listen to people's reasons why they're refusing. And if you've got all the risk assessments there, like I said before, if you've got your paper trail, you can objectively justify it, you should be fine. But if not, then it could amount to a protected act. So if you then dismiss them as a result of it for whatever reason, and they say, well, actually, it's because I raised health and safety issues, then that could amount to quite a substantial claim. So we're seeing it quite a lot at the moment, where employers are literally doing exactly what I've just said and not realizing the legal implications, because the value of those claims is really high, and also the cost of defending them is high. So, you know, getting it right from the start is definitely the more cost-effective way to deal with these situations, which I'm sure all of you are doing anyway, but it's just something to be aware of, because a lot of employers don't do it necessarily on purpose. They might, so for example, they may have done a bit of the guide, they're following it in the best way that they can, but it's often the case that an individual may raise an issue because they have a disability, and then that's why, so they're you know, more heightened anxiety around coming back to work. And so you really do need to balance those concerns, whether there's a disability, whether adjustments need to be made, and whether there really is a health and safety breach. And if there isn't, then you need to deal with that in a really practical way and explain to the individual, both verbally and in writing, that you're satisfied that there isn't a health and safety breach, and that you've dealt with it in accordance with the government guidance. But whistleblowing is a massive area. So again, I could literally talk about it for hours, which I wouldn't bore you to death with. But it is equally something that you need to be mindful of when people are returning to work, because when this happened last time, lots of people came to us. We represent both employees and employers, so we were seeing arguments on both sides. And it was really, really something that was very, very, very common, which obviously a lot of employers just didn't realise. So yeah, it's just really about looking out for some of those signs. And if you're not sure, often what happens is organisations aren't sure, or they're under-resourced, or, you know, they're struggling financially. We've got a free helpline. You can email our helpline and, you know, just put the question to us, and we can try and help you through that. Don't feel like you have to struggle through what can be a really challenging time when people are refusing to come back to work, or raising allegations that you're not doing things properly, because we're all in uncharted territory. It is really difficult right now, and not everybody's going to get it right every time. But there are ways that if you reach out and speak to someone sooner rather than later, you can actually mitigate your risk significantly. Okay, I will always do this. So rabbit on. So talking about refusal to return, I've obviously mentioned the fact that you need to follow the government guidance. Now, if you followed that, then I can't see how how they could reasonably say they're not coming in. There's an argument to say that if they refuse and it's safe for them to come in, and they don't have, it's not like a reasonable adjustment that's needed, but they just don't want to come in because they don't think it's safe because it's coronavirus, for example, that could potentially end up in a disciplinary, because essentially you're asking them as a manager or as a business owner to come into work. They're contracted to come into work, and if they have to come in to do their job and there's no other way that they can do it, or the fact that the workplace is safe, so even where they can work from home but the workplace is safe, then they should be going to work. Otherwise that could be a failure to follow a reasonable management instruction. So again, there's a bit of scope there where individuals are unreasonably refusing to come into work, because that just makes it really difficult for employers trying to manage their workforce, not only in the actual workplace, but obviously those who are still either furloughed or home working. So if that happens, again, it's all about balancing whether or not it's unreasonable on their part, or actually it might be something that you can support them with by way of a reasonable adjustment or additional risk assessments. I've already mentioned about considering disabilities. It does come up quite a lot, and I think it's something that, again, will come up as part of your risk assessments. Now, if you're not doing the risk assessments properly, you might not identify if someone has a disability, but generally if they're starting to refuse or not engage with the process, that they will usually say it's because of. So try to identify if somebody does have a disability, and if so, how that stops them from coming into the workplace, and if there are any adjustments. But equally, if we go back to work, for example, in an office, but the schools are open, but then say, for example, they have to self-isolate because, I don't know, someone in the class or the teachers had COVID, then just be mindful again that someone might refuse to come into work because they don't have childcare. So again, just be mindful of personal circumstances for every individual, and kind of take things on a case-by-case basis. I think having a blanket approach to everybody doesn't always help. As I said before, it is a difficult time for everybody, but equally, I think for employers it can be overwhelming, but also for the individual. A lot of people will have been at home and not really seen anybody. So perhaps if you've got quite a busy workplace, consider things like shift work and phased returns rather than bringing everybody back at once. And if you're going to do that, one of the ways to approach it might be to actually ask for volunteers, for people who want to come back, because there are a lot of people who don't want to work from home right now because they don't have a space at home, or they live with lots of people and it's really not a productive workspace, or they've got 5 children running around. So some people might actually prefer to be back at the office and other people might prefer to be at home. So if you are going to stagger it or have phased returns, then really do engage and consult with your staff. Don't just ask everybody to do the same thing, and that could again form part of your risk assessment, so you can identify those that are at higher risk, maybe ask them to continue working at home for longer. So yeah, there's lots to consider when you're bringing people back, but I think the key thing is about communication. Oh, sorry, I've just picked that off. The key things about communication, and I think it's really important that throughout the entire process you communicate effectively. First of all, about what's expected, how it will work, the health and safety that you've done. Don't just ask people to come back, because that will make people feel anxious. This is the 3rd lockdown now. Everyone's resilience is pretty low. Morale's pretty low. So I think it's really important that we, as business owners, and I've got my own business as well and my own team, and part of that is about us leading people through this. So it's not just putting things in place and expecting everyone to agree. Okay, big topic. So I've done quite a lot of stuff around vaccinations, and I've got a really detailed blog that I can send out to everybody with all these questions answered, but also about 10 others. So I did quite a lot of stuff for BBC World, Sky News, and a couple of other online publications around really what is the law around vaccinations and how is it going to impact the workplace. Now, this is the first time we've really had to discuss this. I think as I've been an employment lawyer for over 10 years, and we've never had these conversations about mandating vaccines. So first of all, I'd like, if anybody has already considered in their workplace vaccination policies, whether to put it in their contracts, whether to mandate it, please put in the chat box. I'd be really interested to see if it's already a topic of conversation in your workplace. and also what people's views are, because I think it's actually quite a controversial topic. So I think it's something we can talk about together at the end of this presentation. But whilst you guys are thinking about what to put in the chat box, I'm just going to answer some of these questions, which are the most common questions that we're seeing at the moment about returning to work and whether or not people can actually force their staff, or businesses can force their staff to have a vaccine. Now, you might have seen the Pimlico Plumbers case where they, I mean, to be honest, I think they did it as a bit of a publicity stunt. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but essentially they said, no jab, no job, as the headline, as their policy. My views on that are you can't force someone to have a vaccine. It's too intrusive and it's a potential breach of human rights, right to a private life. You know, that's, for me, that's a step too far to physically force somebody to have a vaccine. So what some businesses are doing is they are putting it in their contracts to say that all new starters have to have a vaccine. Some organisations are actually consulting with staff and saying they're putting it in the contract and saying if you can't return to work unless you have a vaccine. And others are just having a policy. So a policy that would say, you know, we encourage you to have a vaccine and these are the benefits to the business and to you. So you can see the different approaches there. One is making it mandatory to new starters. One is actually changing current staff's terms and conditions and making it mandatory. And others are encouraging or incentivizing in a policy. Now, all of those different, they've all got issues. If you're mandating new starters, it's slightly different, because for me, the only real risk would be potential discrimination. For example, somebody might not be able to have a vaccine because of a religious reason, or because they're pregnant, and those are protected characteristics. So again, just thinking about the indirect implications of forcing someone. If you change your staff's terms to require that, you first of all have to consult with them, because you can't unilaterally vary the terms. Secondly, you need to check the contract and see how much notice you're supposed to give of any change of terms. And then thirdly, you've still got the whole piece around discrimination, which I'll come on to in a little bit more detail. Secondly, though, with the mandatory of vaccinations of actual current staff, you've also got the fact that if they refuse, what do you do? Because you can't, I mean, my view is you can't force them to have a new contract and then say if they don't, then sack them. I think if you did that, it would be, and they've got more than 2 years employment, then they would have a claim for unfair dismissal, because it's not a fair reason to sack somebody. You have to have a fair reason, such as capability, conduct, or redundancy, and it doesn't really fall within any of those categories. So obviously it's an untested area. We've never had these cases in tribunal ever before. So that's my legal opinion. And, you know, there are people who obviously have very different opinions. But I think from what I've seen, it's a very, very controversial and risky route to go down, to mandate it. What I think employers should do, if they want their staff to have a vaccine, is they should consider a policy on that, and that policy should set out what the company's position is, whether or not they'll pay for it, whether they're not they'll give them time off, whether or not they will support them if they get sick because of the vaccine in terms of paid sick leave, and also just generally how it will work. So, for example, if you're forcing as an employer to someone to have a vaccine, or even just encouraging them, where do you store that data? Is it covered in your data protection policy? You know, your privacy notice. It's a medical it's not a treatment, but you know what I mean. It's a medical process that you're going through. So will it be done in the workplace? Will you ask? So you've really got to think about the process and the rules and how it will all work. And I think it's better placed in a policy rather than mandating it in a contract. So yeah, if you do put it in a policy, I do think that you should give individuals time off for that, and it should be paid if you're asking them to do it. You're not forcing them, but you're still asking them. And I think obviously at the moment we don't know who's actually going to pay for them, whether the government will roll that out to workplaces like they've done with testing, or whether the employer or the individual have to pay. Now, if it's the employer putting it in a policy, I think the employer should pay. If it's the individual's choice, then it's up to them. You know, obviously, some people will already be vaccinated, so that's, you know, it's not really applying to them, but it's the wider workforce. And I alluded to before people who can't be vaccinated. So again, considering things like pregnant women, or I know that there's a lot of talk online about the fact that women of a certain age don't want to have the vaccine because there's risk to fertility. So again, it's whether or not that would be sex discrimination, and there's a lot of indirect stuff which again is just untested. So it's whether you want to go down that route. I mean, there's no, you can obviously businesses can do that, but there is a real risk that there'll be some backlash in terms of discrimination if you are either dismissing someone as a result, or refusing them to come into the workplace, for example, or you're saying, actually, we're not going to pay you until you have a vaccine. We've seen it. People are starting to have these conversations with their staff, and I don't think that's the right way to go. You know, we need to work together to get through the next few months once we come out of lockdown. And taking a really bullish approach around vaccinations, I think, is the wrong way. There are going to be people who, like I said before, who don't want to have it because of a religious reason. They're not, I mean, when I last researched it, I couldn't find out what the ingredients were, but if there's gelatine in there, then it might not be suitable for certain religions. And again, there's even stuff around veganism and how, you know, if it's got gelatine in and then it's against their belief, and that could be a philosophical belief which is covered. So it's such a wide area and it's so untested. I wouldn't want to be an employer who ends up being the one that's the test case. So it's just stuff that you need to think about if you are going down that road. And obviously, I'll take any questions on that if you've got any. And I'll also be interested to see if anyone's already had those discussions. I know about a month or so ago, there were organisations asking us to draft policies on it because they were considering their position. Obviously, at the moment, it's not been rolled out to businesses, but people are thinking about it now because it's what next. So testing, I think testing is a bit different because it's less invasive, and actually I think people to obviously take the choice to have a test when they go abroad. What we're finding is businesses are, some businesses are actually paying for tests in the workplace. So these are the lateral flow tests that you can do. They're the immediate response. So your PCR ones, they're the ones that the NHS do, and obviously they're meant to be for people with symptoms. So we wouldn't recommend that employers are using those generally for access to work. If it's access to work, then you can use the lateral flow ones. And actually, they're now saying that there's going to be no cost to the employer. So that's something that's new only recently, where they're saying that employers with more than 50 employees can apply for that. If you're a smaller employer, for some reason, you're not included, but you can still mandate testing. But again, I would have a policy around it and explain that you'll cover the cost if you're mandating it, and what that process will be, what happens with the data afterwards. So just really think about the full procedure in terms of what happens, who does what, when, how often it needs to happen, and what the requirements will be to enter the workplace. So again, that might come as part of your COVID risk assessments, is that actually you introduce testing as part of that. And again, I'd be really interested to see if anyone's already doing mandatory testing in their workplace and how that's gone, or if they've had any challenges or pushbacks from people refusing to have a test and then refusing to come to work. Now, in my view, if you're asking someone to be tested to come to work, I think if they refuse to do that, that could be seen as an unreasonable refusal to follow a management instruction. So again, provided you have gone about it by consulting staff, introducing it as a policy, you're paying for it and you're letting them do it in work time, I think that's reasonable for you to expect that in the current circumstances that they would be tested. If they unreasonably refuse, it could be a potential disciplinary. I mean, no one wants to go down that road, but we are finding that there are some people being difficult, and employers need to effectively manage their staff and their businesses. So it is possible to do that, but I don't think it is with the vaccines. I think it's a very different, very different approach for the two. So any questions on that, I'll answer them at the end. I'm going to touch on mental health, because I think when we return from what has been 3 lockdowns and the most crazy 12 months that we've been through as a nation. We are going to find, and I've actually already written a white paper on this, so if anyone's interested in understanding the impact of COVID on mental health, I'll happily send them a link. It's not that long, it's about a couple of pages, but what I've done is I've consolidated the research on all the different areas in terms of impact. So looking at the impact of social isolation, the fact that people have less access to services such as psychiatric support and therapy, especially group therapy, because that was all cancelled. Some people not being able to get any help whatsoever because there's just no access to support for 6 to 9 months in some areas. It's pretty much a postcode lottery. And obviously working from home and being on a screen all the time, that has a profound impact on so many individuals' mental health. And this is going to be really crucial for moving forward, that we understand that and put things in place now to support all of our workforce, including management, to come out of lockdown and back in a resilient manner. I certainly have seen over the past, I don't know, 6 or 7 months, the resilience of everybody is dropping. I think everyone's a bit at the end of their tether. Everyone's feeling a bit burnt out, a bit overwhelmed, and just generally quite anxious about what next. I do think the vaccines give people some hope, but again, especially some organisations, there's been a real struggle, and some people have no income at all, especially if they've been on maternity leave or they're self-employed or they've recently set up a business and things like that. There's lots of people where they've fallen through the cracks. So just be mindful of that and the impact that will have on their mental health, and really consider how you can support people now rather than waiting till they come back and then going through these risk assessments and everyone's really anxious. If you put things in place now whilst we're still in lockdown, you can start to support people and they'll build that trust, so that when you want to bring people back, they're more likely to cooperate because you've supported them with their mental health. So people with anxiety, I've got anxiety, by the way, and I don't like uncertainty. That's part of my mental health condition, and a lot of people with anxiety are the same. It's an intolerance of uncertainty, effectively. So imagine the impact of not knowing when you're coming out of lockdown or when you're going to see your family and that kind of thing. That has a really profound impact on people with anxiety. Obviously OCD is a huge one. Keeping clean, we're always told to wash our hands. Whilst OCD isn't obviously limited to hand washing, we are finding that people with OCD are really struggling right now, especially because they don't want to leave the house. That then develops into things like agoraphobia, don't want to use public transport, don't want to go to the office. So all of these things might come up in risk assessments, but equally supporting people who don't have a diagnosed condition, and generally providing support on how to manage stress, resilience, general mental health awareness, and just having an open door policy and just understanding how to support your staff and encouraging self-care can be really, really beneficial at this stage. So what we're finding is lots of employers are, running workshops or running initiatives or challenges in the workplace. We're doing a steps challenge this month to encourage people to walk, to get outside. We've got a WhatsApp group where everyone has to post a screenshot of their steps every day. So it's just really, it doesn't have to be as as serious as a webinar on what is mental health. It can be, it's more than that. It's about well-being, and it's really about encouraging people to stay connected. We might not be physically connected, but we can still be socially connected, and I think that's a really important message. Don't forget people because they're at home. You're not seeing them, so things like risk assessments can be really helpful. And I've talked a lot in previous talks that I've done for Danny and Simply People, but risk assessments is something that I'm actually campaigning for the government to help businesses with. This is about wellbeing risk assessments. So looking at how you can support individuals, how to open those conversations. And I had a meeting with an MP today, actually, who is helping me to get that to Parliament, so that basically I want the government to help you guys and to help businesses with how you should support people with mental health, and look at the type of risk assessment and actually support with the funding of that, and also the structure. There is a company that we use at the moment who are great. If anyone is interested, I will happily introduce you because I think they're fab. But essentially the risk assessments that we do them every 3 months, and it's anonymous through a piece of tech. And obviously, because we don't see everybody anymore, so it's a really great way of understanding what people need, what they're stressed about. But because it's anonymous, they're really honest. And off the back of that, the individual gets a self-care report and 3 areas that they need to improve for the next 3 months. So that might be sleep, nutrition, it might be stress levels, it might be movement, it might be drinking more. It's a holistic approach. It's not just focused on mental health. But for me as a business owner, the best thing about the risk assessments is looking at from a big picture, from a business point of view, what the areas are that I need to support my team with. So whilst I don't know on an individual basis what their individual self-assessments come out as, they get that and they get to keep that. It's completely confidential. What I get as a business is a report that tells me 35% of your staff feel that they've got too much of a workload, or like 89% of your staff are struggling with sleep, or whatever it might be. It gives me a percentage so I can pick the areas that I want to invest my time in. And obviously my time, my money, and also the staff, like what do they need, rather than just putting free fruit on a Friday or putting a yoga session on. Why not target what support they actually need by using these risk assessments and using the data? And then each time you do it, you can start to see an improvement. And when you can see that, and you can see that the work that you're doing is actually really helping people, your people will appreciate it, but also they will be more productive, they'll be more loyal, because they'll see that you're really investing in them. So as you can see, I'm very passionate about using this type of approach. But I do think it's important, because you don't want to seem tokenistic, because people just won't engage. So yeah, if anybody is interested, I can link them. So just drop me an email afterwards. The other thing to really consider is really, from my perspective, I lead by example. So when I talk about self-care, I talk about the kind of things that I do. I encourage people to have breaks. I encourage people to get outside. I talk about doing yoga, or I'll talk about doing a workout, to encourage that conversation around self-care, so that people don't feel they have to work all the time. And if I see people working late, I like call them out on it, and I ask them why are they doing that. They don't need to be doing that. Because a lot of it is, people slip into bad habits working from home. So I think, as a business leader, if you can lead by example now, that will really help people come out of the position that we're in into the new normal, whatever that will look like. Who knows? I don't really like the name new normal, actually, but you know what I mean. It's that kind of, well, what is the new workplace going to look like? So yeah, self-care is a really important part of managing mental health and well-being in the workplace, but it starts at the top. And if we don't lead by example, then people aren't going to be open and honest with us, but they're also not going to practice what we're saying that they should be doing. And I do think that we need to think long term in terms of our own teams, but also generally everybody's going to be feeling a bit anxious when they come back, maybe a bit overwhelmed. I don't think everybody's going to just come back to work and be like, okay, we're fine now, let's go back to normal. There's going to be a transition, and people will take a different amount of time, and people will be in different places on their journey, depending on the personal circumstances. So again, just be mindful of that. It can, people have stuff going on outside of work, and that's something that we really need to consider as we come back into, again, as I say, the new normal. But the reality is, I think what lockdown has shown us is that, we all have a life outside of work. We've seen kids jumping on Zoom calls, my dog's barking, which, by the way, my dog's not barked yet, which is good. He's asleep. But the reality is, we've seen in people's homes. So, if we can learn anything from what we've been through, is that humility and, the whole idea around flexible working, which takes me on to the future of flexible working. So I actually wrote a blog at the beginning of the first lockdown called, "Is this the home working revolution that we've all been asking for?" And the reason I wrote it was because especially law firms don't let people work from home. They want to see you billing by the hour, and they want you sat at your desk. But the reality is, for me anyway, working from home is really, I found it really helpful. With anxiety, I like to be in a really quiet space. So obviously running my business and being in the office, everybody's firing questions at me. So I've been much more productive working from home. Not everybody has. But the reality is, a lot of businesses have had to try it, and now have seen some benefits. So again, I'd be really interested to hear from everybody on today what your views are on home working and whether you'll continue using it, whether you'll have a hybrid approach, whether you'll just adopt flexible working. So for example, at Thrive, we've considered, like, after lockdown, what we're going to do is continue to work from home, but we have an office, so we don't require people to work hours or location. We say work smart, so you work when and where you want, but make sure you get your work done. So everybody has like a minimum requirement of targets that they have to meet, but it's not based on hours or location. And I think that's really important, because that flexibility allows, some of my team might go for a walk at 11 o'clock or play badminton at 3. So it encourages a healthier lifestyle, and actually the output from them it's actually increased. So even though they're working less hours, the productivity and the output is higher. So that for me shows that it works, and I'm really keen to allow people to continue working in that way for the foreseeable. So when we come out of lockdown, we won't be going back to the office full time. All my paralegals were in the office prior. It was the solicitors that worked mostly from home, but now everybody works from home, and we've got everything streamlined. So again, just think about, well, what's it going to look like? Could you keep some of it from home? And actually just looking at the reality of this home working and reality of the actual life of home working post lockdown. So don't forget that measuring someone's performance during lockdown whilst they're homeschooling is not the same as what their productivity would be like if they were working from home normally, or if they were working flexibly. So again, take that into consideration when you're thinking about the future of flexible working in your organisation. Try not to penalise people for their performance during lockdown, because let's face it, it's been pretty tough this time. I do think there's going to be a lot of requests. So as an employment lawyer, one of the things we advise on a regular basis is requests for reasonable adjustments and flexible working requests. They're the two things that come up the most often. Now, flexible working requests at the moment, you have to, and for those of you that aren't aware, you have to have been employed for 26 weeks before you have the right to make a request. If you make a request, you don't have the right for it to be granted. The employer then has to consider that against the business needs, and the business then can decide whether to accept the request, make an alternative suggestion, or refuse it. But they have to be able to objectively justify that refusal. So it's, at the moment, it's very much like a formal process that you have to go through, but there are several consultations ongoing. So it's quite interesting to see that I'm actually part of the Law Society Employment Law Committee, so we consult with the government around the changes on employment law. So the government will say, we've got X, Y, and Z, we want to change, what do you think? And we advise them and consult around that. And one of the things that's come up recently is about flexible working, and saying, actually, should it be, why do you have to work 26 weeks to ask for it? And actually encouraging employers to have those conversations from the outset, rather than it being a conversation that you have to wait 26 weeks for. Because if you need the flexible working from day one, why would, just, to me, it doesn't make sense. So I personally think it should be a day one right to make the request. Obviously, if it doesn't work for the employer, then it doesn't work. But equally, why wait 26 weeks and struggle for 26 weeks? Like, if it could work, why not allow them to do it? So that consultation is ongoing, and the Welsh Government have already announced that they have a long-term ambition, which I think is quite interesting, because they're saying actually they want at least 30% of workers to still be at home. So I think the landscape will change. I think organisations will still embrace a level of flexible working, whether that's home working or flexibility in terms of hours remains to be seen. But I've certainly seen a big shift in a lot of our clients in how they approach this. So if you are going to engage in any of these different ways of working when you come back, just make sure you update your policies. What are you requiring of people? How do they deal with requests? If they're working from home, do they need permission? Do they not? How does it work? So just really think about how the practicalities will work, especially when you've got a lot of people and you want to kind of know where everybody is. So make sure your processes are really clear, and obviously that they're communicated effectively to your team. So that's almost me done. I'm just going to quickly say how we can help you before I go to questions. So obviously we're lawyers, so we can help with employment law advice, or you can outsource to us. We can help us from an individual perspective, if you're an individual in a workplace, or we can help a company and represent an organisation both internally from a HR perspective, but also if tribunals come up, we have our own in-house barristers. So yeah, we can basically support anyone with any queries that are HR or employment law related. We have the free advice line is on there. So we actually have a BLM support line as well. That's really aimed at organisations and or individuals who are struggling with race discrimination in the workplace. The coronavirus helpline is the one that I said before. If you've got a query and you're not really sure about vaccines or testing or whatever, and it's quite personal and you don't want to post it in the chat, you can email it to us on that helpline, and it's free. So we're happy to answer. It's not an advice line, it's a helpline, so it's just one question, not like a 2-page advice. But we've helped nearly 3,000 people for free on that helpline, which is really exciting. And there's loads of stuff about all the things I've talked about on YouTube. So I've got loads of videos from when I've done the news interviews, but also bits about like furlough and holiday pay and redundancies, how to do them fairly, maternity, all sorts of stuff. So there's loads of bits on there, and it's all free, so help yourself. And then Thrive Wellbeing, just going to quickly talk about we've got our own wellbeing platform, and again, I basically created it in the last lockdown because so many people weren't sure how to support their staff with wellbeing. So it's got an interactive training session, which is like about an hour, loads of guides, toolkits, and then we basically will support and update it on a quarterly basis. It's member led. And the idea is that all staff have access, managers have a separate access point with managers' materials. And then on a quarterly basis, we take feedback from our members, and the members basically then feedback and say, right, do you know what, we could really do with something on neurodiversity, or we need something on how to make adjustments. So I will then create some videos or some toolkits or some checklists or some guides, and we'll just keep evolving it to what our members need. So the idea behind it really is just to help people at the moment keep the conversation going. We do have a 3-day free access at the moment, so if anybody does want to, even if you just want it for yourself, just to go through the champion training, and it just helps with things like resilience, stress, and managing overwhelm, and understanding mental health conditions and avoiding suicides. There's quite a lot of really helpful tools in there. And we also have loads of emails, policies, and all the stuff I was talking about before, like wellbeing policies. They're all in there as templates, which you can download for your own business. So that's me. I feel like I've spoken for ages, and I hope there's lots of questions. Danny?
You have spoken for ages, Jodie, so thank you for that. So there are a number of questions that I will run through and get you to answer, if that's okay. So first one's, I've put you down as the answerer. So the first one is, under health and safety regs, is there any explicit or absolute requirement to conduct an individual employee risk assessment?
I'm not a health and safety advisor, so I can't guarantee. I don't actually know the answer.
I can probably answer that one, actually. It's probably one that I'm probably within my comfort zone. So I am a health and safety practitioner by trade. In terms of the regs, it would probably be a little bit woolly. What I'd say about an individual employee risk assessment is you'd normally be expected to do an individual risk assessment on anyone that sits outside of your normal risk assessment. So anyone that's at increased risk, you need to understand how you'd control additional risks to that individual.
Yeah, I was going to say as well, there is a requirement to do a stress risk assessment for anyone I think under the HSE guidance, but I don't know about the actual. Are you meaning like the COVID risk assessments? Was that the question?
I think that's what John's referring to. I think is a requirement to conduct an individual employee risk assessment. And as I say, from my perspective, it would be if they are outside the ordinary control measures, say that you'd need to do additional control measures for that particular person, then you'd be expected to do a risk assessment to show how you're controlling that, or at least that's what I'd be looking for if I was in that environment. So hopefully that's answered. If not, I'm sure you'll drop onto the questions, John. Next question, Jodie, is what about employee who is desperate to come back to work, i.e. mental health degraded through lack of social interaction whilst home working, but for whom the employer is unable to adequately control the transmission risks? Can the employer obligate them to continue to work from home whilst being aware that this is injurious to their health?
So they can't. So at the moment, I'm presuming the question is related more to after lockdown. So obviously, at the moment, you have to work from home, so that's fine. If it's after lockdown and you're saying that you can't comply with the government guidance to make sure it's a safe workplace, then yes, you can require them still to work from home. Alternatively, you can try and find another location. I know that I've seen a couple of people actually who really struggle with their mental health, and the organisations have found another location for them to work, and they've hired a space that was a safe space. So it depends on your resources, but there's no obligation on you to do that. But obviously, if you're trying to support their well-being and you know they're really struggling, either try and make the workplace a safe place, or try and find an alternative location that they can use, even if it's just one day a week, like a co-working space somewhere.
Yeah, I'd add on to that as well from a health and safety perspective that if you know there is an increased risk, then you wouldn't let them back into the workplace anyway, or that you
Exactly.
shouldn't.
That's
The
it. So
next,
you can only let them back in if it's safe. You can't, obviously, balancing their mental health, but the reality is the government guidance is there, and from an HSE perspective, you shouldn't be allowing them in if it's not a safe environment, and I can't guarantee it's COVID secure.
yeah, there's a couple more questions now around the question you asked about vaccinations. So not everyone can have them. You're right. Some workplaces will be unsafe with no vaccines, i.e. healthcare. We won't be managing vaccines, but we will be advertising, highly encouraging it. We've discussed tracking who's vaccinated. Should it impact what policies we need to follow in office? I'd love to see if we could offer in office additional optional jabs once they are more widely available. So I think that's another comment on your question around are people vaccinating.
Yeah.
We've seen some companies discussing. This is an interesting one. This is one I'd like to get your opinion on. Actually, we've seen some companies discussing offering a spot bonus or financial incentive for people to get them, or offering better health benefits for those who do as an incentive. The idea of incentivization versus requirement is an interesting discussion to have.
It is, and actually, I would avoid incentivizing people, not least because if you're incentivizing some individuals and some physically can't have it because of for a medical or disability related reason or pregnancy related, then it could be discriminatory the incentivization itself. So again, when I was talking before about the reasons why people could legitimately refuse it, they wouldn't be eligible simply because they're disabled or simply because they're pregnant, but in turn would make it a discriminatory policy. So you'd have to be able to objectively justify it, which I think it's untested territory at the moment. But equally, I think it would be a bit of an uphill struggle because we don't know that the vaccine is going to stop transmission at the moment. So I think it's a really difficult one to say, oh well, it's a justified reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, really interesting point though, because it's something that businesses are looking at. But then I suppose you've got to balance that with the risk, and if obviously you can do it, but it's really I wouldn't advise to do it. I think it's not without risk, and I think it's also not a very inclusive way to approach the situation. I think encouraging people and explaining the risks and how it'll work is a great way to approach it, but equally being mindful of people's personal circumstances and if they're a protected characteristic, because you've got the individuals that will feel that they're either being excluded or left out, but you've also got the risk of expensive claims.
Yeah. Next question, if employer mandates vaccine and employee consequently has an adverse reaction, including death, would the employer in any way be liable?
So there is actually, I found this the other day, there's a compensation fund available for individuals who have a severe reaction, but it has to be a disabling severe reaction. This is more personal injury, not employment law, so I don't know all the rules around it, but there is something on the government website about it. And there's a video on Daniel Barnett's YouTube, who's an employment barrister, and he talks about in a bit of detail. So I mean, if the person who's asked the question wants to email me, I'll send you a link to the details on that. But essentially, it depends situation, but there is a fund available in terms of compensation as a result.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure that'll be useful. Can you put in a policy if you work in a general office space versus a manufacturing mandatory in-person environment?
Put what in a policy? Sorry.
I'm guessing she's referring to vaccinations or the need to make vaccinations mandatory or testing mandatory.
Yeah, so you can put regardless of what the workplace is, you can put whether it's testing or vaccinations, you can put it in a policy. That's absolutely fine. It's just what the policy says, and whether or you've got to consider the discriminatory element. It doesn't necessarily have to be a factory environment. In fact, I think I definitely read something recently where it was saying actually offices were one of the main causes of the spread at one point because of the nature of the way we work in an office. So yeah, I certainly think it's something that businesses are asking us to do, and they are office based. So yeah, you can do.
Awesome. I think the next few things that are on those questions are actually statements. So somebody saying they'll have a hybrid approach in the office, partly
Nice.
working from home, partly working flexibly, which is great. Jane's said about supporting people and likes an approach which is tight, loose, tight, which is tight on objectives, loose on the how and where, and tight on the quality time, the outcomes. Positive outcomes, not on hours, which I think quite a few
Love.
people tend to share, and it's certainly something that I generally look at is the outcomes as opposed to clock watching.
Yeah, definitely. It's about that you get the whole presenteeism thing. If you just expect people to be physically sat there, you want people to be productive. And yeah, outcome based is way better than hours. And in law firms, they do everything on hourly billable hours, and I think it's ridiculous. So we don't do any of that at Thrive. It's not encouraged.
Yeah, perfect. And it's the best way to be, I guess. So that's the end of the questions. That's the end of the webinar. Thank you so much to everyone that's joined us for this evening's presentation by Jodie. Next Thursday is disability and reasonable adjustments. We hope to see you there. In the interim, if you need a copy of the recording or a certificate for your file, please do let me know, and we'll arrange for that to be sent out to yourselves as well. We hope you've enjoyed the sessions, and see you again next time. Thanks for joining.